Lecture 7, Homer, The Iliad.
Hello, and welcome back to Lecture 7. In this lecture, we're going to begin our survey of ancient Greek literature by talking about the nature of Homeric epic and then turning to look in some detail at the first of the two great Homeric epics, the Iliad. Now, the two Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are the first fully developed epics in Western culture. They are much longer than the Epic of Gilgamesh that we talked about in Lecture 2. They're also much more complex. The characterization is much deeper and richer, and they're much more intricate than the Epic of Gilgamesh, both in their structure and in their narrative style. Because of Greece's influence on later Western culture and literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey served really as the models for all later epic in Western culture. Now, by epic, the Greeks themselves simply meant any long narrative poem in one particular meter. The meter is called dactylic hexameter. That was all they meant by the term. Epic in ancient Greek did not have any reference to subject matter or to content. It simply meant a poem written in dactylic hexameter. However, as it happened, the two Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, focused on warfare and on the adventures of a hero, in the case of the Odyssey, his adventures on the way back from the Trojan War, and therefore Greece's influence on later European culture meant that the Homeric epics were taken as models for what epic should be, not just in form, a long narrative poem, but also in content. And so the term epic came to mean narrative poem dealing with gods and heroes, very often with war and adventure. And then, of course, we've expanded the term to mean, in effect, any long narrative of whatever form. We can refer to an epic novel, an epic movie, and so forth. In fact, interestingly enough, it's because of the association of the term epic with the content of the Iliad and the Odyssey that scholars call the Gilgamesh story the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's no such word in the Akkadian language, and there's no title for the poem that was found on those tablets in the ruins of the Library of Nineveh, as I talked about in lecture number 2. But when scholars translated this narrative poem about Gilgamesh, they looked at it and they said, what we've got here is clearly an epic, comparing it to the Homeric form, and therefore we call it the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Iliad and the Odyssey were primary cultural texts for classical Greek civilization. By that, I mean that they served as educational tools. They were the works that boys would study first and foremost in school. They also served as paradigms for exempla of how one should and should not behave, as sources for quotation. If you're trying to make a rhetorical point in a Greek law court and you can quote a line of Homer, that clinches the point you're trying to make. And so they were absolutely foundational and primary texts in Greek culture. They also provide, from the later viewpoint, they're also important because they provide the fullest accounts that we have of several episodes from the Trojan War, one of the primary and most important myths of Greco-Roman civilization. Now, neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey tells the full story of the war, but they do give us our fullest accounts of some very important episodes from that war. But as I touched upon in the introductory lecture to this part of the course, despite their status as foundational works of Greek literature, the Homeric epics reflect several centuries of orally transmitted poetry. I already spoke about some of the implications of that in the first lecture, the introductory lecture. Here I just want very briefly to tell you a little bit about how it is that we know that the Iliad and the Odyssey were originally composed orally, rather than being composed by one poetic genius writing in the 8th or 7th century BC. First of all, the events described in the Iliad and the Odyssey took place in the 12th century BC. The traditional date that the Greeks themselves gave for the fall of Troy and the Trojan War was 1184 BC. So that's about the time frame, the early 12th century, for when the Trojan War took place. However, we know that the alphabet was not introduced into Greece until many centuries later. Most scholars would place the advent of the alphabet in Greece, adopted from the Phoenician alphabet, in the 8th century. Some scholars put it a little earlier, some put it a little later, but most think that the alphabet came into Greece in the 8th century BC. So if the events described by the Iliad and the Odyssey took place in the 12th century, but there's no writing till the 8th century, there's a 400-year gap when those stories had to have been carried on orally. Now, of course, that tells us nothing about the form in which they were carried on. And here, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into any detail at all. In my teaching company course on the Iliad, I spend an entire lecture discussing this. This is what's called the Homeric question, the question of whether there was one author who wrote both epics, or even one author per epic, or whether they're the culmination of a centuries-long oral poetic tradition. For now, I'll just say that in 1928, a brilliant American scholar named Milman Parry demonstrated through analyzing the language, the poetic form, and so forth of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Milman Parry demonstrated that these poems show all the hallmarks of oral composition and oral performance, that what we have in these texts, in effect, is a recording of an oral poet singing an orally performed poem rather than a literary work from the beginning. Just about every modern scholar accepts Milman Parry's demonstration that the Homeric epics are grounded in traditional oral composition, but scholars still disagree on the implications of that fact for our understanding of exactly how the poems came into being and came into the form in which we have them. Most particularly, we do not know, and probably never will know, how they came to be written down. Milman Parry, working with modern-day oral bards, working in a purely oral tradition, Serbo-Croatian bards, found that, at least in modern days, a bard who works orally, who is himself illiterate and who composes as he sings, is very, very scornful of writing. He sees it as a crutch. He sees it as a diminution of his tradition. So it is highly unlikely that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written down by the same oral bard who performed them. How they came to be written down, who did it, how he did it, sitting there with a roll of papyrus and trying to scribble away as the bard performed, we do not know. All we know is that somehow these orally composed works came to be put in writing because, after all, we have them. So these are very, very vast questions that scholars still debate and disagree about, but there is general consensus that we are dealing with poems that originally were composed orally. The mythic background of the Homeric epics, as I've already mentioned, is the story of the Trojan War, which is the most famous myth or legend, whichever you want to call it, in Greco-Roman literature. The war took place, as most people know, when the Trojan prince Paris kidnapped the Greek woman Helen, who was wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris kidnapped her, took her away to Troy with him. Menelaus' elder brother Agamemnon raised a fleet of 1,000 ships and an army to man it, and sailed to Troy to retrieve Helen. The abduction of Helen was seen as an offense against the entire family, not just against Menelaus himself, and so Agamemnon, as the elder brother, was responsible for heading the expedition to get her back. The war over Helen lasted for 10 years, and it ended when the Greeks resorted to trickery with the ruse of the Trojan horse. Now, as I already mentioned, neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey gives us the entire story of the Trojan War. Luckily, we have the entire story in bits and pieces scattered throughout ancient literature, so we can reconstruct it. The Iliad focuses on events that happened during a short period in the last year of the war. The Odyssey deals with Odysseus's further adventures after the war. Now, on the most basic level, the Iliad's subject matter is the anger of the great Greek hero Achilles. The opening words of the Iliad are, "Goddess, sing the wrath of Achilles." In fact, in Greek, the very opening word is wrath or anger. Menon is the Greek word. Achilles is angry because Agamemnon, the leader of the expedition, has taken away Achilles' concubine Briseis. And because of this insult, Achilles grows so angry that he withdraws from the fighting. He leaves his fellow Greeks to suffer great losses at the hands of the Trojans. Achilles is the Greeks' greatest fighter, their greatest defender. So when he withdraws from battle, the Greeks begin to suffer great losses at the hands of the Trojans. By starting his narrative with this particular episode, the quarrel of Achilles and Agamemnon in the last year of the war, the bard is able to focus in not on narrating the whole story of the war, but rather on articulating some crucial themes of the warrior ethos, of what it meant to be a warrior in this war. And to understand why Achilles becomes so angry that he wants to leave his fellow soldiers to suffer destruction at the hands of the Trojans, we have to look at the Homeric hero's motivations for fighting in the first place. Remember, Helen was Menelaus' wife. Menelaus and Agamemnon both have a good, strong personal reason for fighting. The rest of these Greek warriors don't. Why are they there? What's in it for them? The answer that Homer would give is what is in it for them is two concepts, time and kleos. Time is often translated honor, and that is what it means, but it means honor in a very tangible, physical sense. Honor in the sense of the gifts or spoils or prizes that a warrior is awarded by his fellow warriors as a representation of how well he has fought. So time does mean honor, but it's honor expressed through gifts, through possessions, through spoils. And often your time is expressed through one particular prize of honor. That's the usual English translation of the Greek word geros. A geros is a particular trophy, a particular prize of honor. Briseis, the concubine, is Achilles' geros. And so when Agamemnon takes away Briseis, he is removing the tangible expression of Achilles' honor, and it is an extremely grievous insult. Kleos, the second thing for which a Homeric hero fights, can be translated as glory or fame. Its most basic meaning is what other people say aloud about you, what is spoken about you, your reputation, your glory, your fame, in particular, what people say about you after you are dead. And of course, the two concepts are interrelated. The more time you have, the greater your kleos is likely to be after your death. So Agamemnon dishonors Achilles by taking away Achilles' geros, his prize of honor, his concubine. Why would Agamemnon do that? He does it because of a loss of honor he himself has suffered. He has had to return his own concubine, Chryseis, to her father at the orders of the god Apollo. So Agamemnon tries to restore his own lost time by taking away Achilles' concubine. And you can see there that time seems to be conceived of as a sort of zero-sum game. If I have more of it, you have less of it. There's a certain amount of goods, of spoils, of loot of war to be apportioned out, and if one person gets more, everyone else gets correspondingly less. So Agamemnon tries to restore his own time by dishonoring, dis-timeing, if I may, Achilles. This is why Achilles is so angry, why he withdraws from battle, and why he declares that he will no longer fight against the Trojans. In fact, he even threatens to return home. And within the context of Achilles' own society, it seems to me that his reaction is not excessive. Modern readers, modern students often say he's acting like a spoiled brat and have very little sympathy for Achilles, but within the framework, the conceptions of his own society, a warrior's sense of worth is very largely determined by how others perceive him and what others say about him. And so Agamemnon has done more than just insult or dishonor Achilles. I'm not trying to exclude the purely personal and sexual insult when one man seduces or takes away another man's concubine. Obviously, there's a personal insult going on there as well. But Agamemnon has done much more than that. He has called Achilles' whole worth, Achilles' whole reason for being there as a warrior into question. And these key concepts that inform the beginning of the Iliad also resonate throughout the whole epic. Time, kleos, the warrior's motivation for fighting, those are important throughout the entire epic. At this point, I want to give you, as quickly as I can, an outline of the plot of the Iliad, and then focus on the important scene at the end where Achilles and King Priam of Troy meet, and there's an astonishing reconciliation scene between the two of them when Achilles returns the dead body of Priam's son Hector. But first, a quick plot outline of the Iliad. From books 2 through 18, the Iliad is 24 books long. That means it took 24 papyrus scrolls to write out the Iliad. From books 2 through 18, Achilles refrains from battle. Throughout these books, we see the results of his withdrawal from battle as the Greeks are ever harder pressed by the Trojans, and under the leadership of the greatest Trojan warrior Hector, the Greeks suffer extensive losses. So from books 2 through 18, Achilles sits in his tent by the seashore and does not help his fellow Greeks. As the battle continues, the Greeks realize that they must do something to change their situation. They need Achilles back. And so Agamemnon selects 3 men to serve as an embassy to Achilles, as it's usually called. This is in Book 9 of the Iliad. Agamemnon sends an embassy to Achilles to ask Achilles to accept Agamemnon's apology and lavish gifts. Agamemnon will not only give Briseis back, and by the way, he promises that he never touched her, but he'll also give Achilles numerous other gifts as well. So he's doing his best to recompense Achilles for the loss of Time by giving him even more Time. The embassy goes to Achilles' tent, but he rejects their pleas very, very forcefully. In fact, Achilles remarks that his mother Thetis, a goddess who has foreknowledge of the future, has informed him, Achilles, that he has 2 possible alternative fates. He can win Kleos by dying at Troy. He can win glory and honor, but he will die at Troy if he stays and fights. Or he can return home and live a long, peaceful, but utterly inglorious life. Achilles says in Book 9 to his friends who have come to ask him to return to battle, he says that he chooses the long, uneventful, inglorious life. He's going to go home, forget about being a warrior, forget about Kleos and all of that. And he counsels the other Greeks to sail home as well. Now, finally, since we're only in Book 9 of the Iliad, obviously Achilles does not leave. Finally, he relents to the extent of saying that he won't sail for home, but he still says he won't return to fighting until the Trojans actually reach the Greek camp and set the Greek ships on fire. So he's not going to help until the war actually comes to the Greek camp itself. The turning point of the Iliad comes in Book 16, not because Achilles changes his mind about the insult that Agamemnon has given him, but rather because Achilles' beloved friend and companion, Patroclus, for those of you who have seen the movie Troy, not his cousin, his beloved friend and companion, Patroclus, goes into battle in Achilles' place. Patroclus asks Achilles for his armor. Patroclus puts on Achilles' recognizable, identifiable armor, goes into battle in the hope that the Trojans will think he is Achilles and that the psychological impact of that will be enough to turn the tide of battle. And so Achilles sends Patroclus into battle in his stead, tells him, be careful, don't go all the way to the walls of Troy, watch out for yourself. Patroclus goes into battle in Achilles' armor and is, of course, killed by Hector. And Patroclus' death is the crucial turning point of the Iliad, because after Patroclus' death in Book 16 and the fight over his body between Greeks and Trojans in Book 17, the Greeks do recover his body, both the focus of the narrative and more particularly Achilles' own character change. From here on out, from the death of Patroclus on, Achilles is no longer concerned about his Time or about Kleos. Instead, he is focused entirely on a desire for vengeance against Hector. And from Book 18 all the way through Book 23, the next to the last book of the Iliad, Achilles' return to battle is foregrounded. He's fueled by a desperate desire for vengeance against Hector. He slays countless other Trojans trying to get to Hector, but his one impulse is to find Hector, meet him, and kill him. And of course, eventually in Book 22, Hector and Achilles do meet in single combat. Achilles kills Hector, and his desire for vengeance continues even after Hector's death. As everyone knows, Achilles ties Hector's body to the back of his chariot and drags the body around the walls of Troy under the eyes of Hector's aged parents, Priam and Hecuba, who are watching from the walls. Book 24, the last book of the Iliad, provides the resolution of the Iliad through a meeting between Achilles and Hector's father, the aged King Priam. Priam comes to Achilles' tent to ask for the body of his son back, to ransom the body of his son. Achilles agrees to return Hector's body, and the Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector. Now, within this basic plot line, Achilles' anger, his withdrawal from battle, his return to battle to get vengeance for Patroclus, one of the most important themes that the poet shows us from various different sides is what can be called the human condition, what it means to be human, what the implications of that are, and most particularly, what it means to be mortal, to have to die, and to have to tolerate the deaths of others. And central, I think, in the Iliad's conception of the human condition is what I like to call the paradox of kleos, specifically the paradox of kleos aphthiton, imperishable glory, undying fame. That's what the phrase kleos aphthiton means in Greek, imperishable glory or undying fame. And this undying fame, this imperishable glory, is the only kind of meaningful immortality available to Homeric warriors. Homer does recognize an afterlife of sorts. There's an underworld, and after death, the soul, the Greek word is psyche, spelled exactly like psyche, which is the word we derive from it, but it means soul or spirit. At death, the psyche leaves the body and goes to the underworld, but the existence of the soul in the underworld is vague, unsubstantial, undifferentiated. In the Odyssey, we're told that the souls of the dead do not even know themselves or recognize one another unless someone gives them a drink of blood, which returns their wits and their minds to them. So while there is an afterlife in the Homeric worldview, it is certainly not one that's calculated to provide any kind of consolation for bodily death. There's no reward for the virtuous. There's nothing like that. There's not even self-awareness, really, in the afterlife. So only kleos, only what people say about you after you die, provides any kind of significant immortality. The Homeric warrior lives on in and only in what others say about him after his death. And that, by the way, is one element that I think the movie Troy got absolutely right. The stress on, even in the voiceover at the very end, the stress on what people will say about us after we are dead, about being talked about, our names being remembered. That's very Homeric. Now, this view of mortality and its implications that I've been outlining here in the Iliad is in many ways very similar to the one we talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the Iliadic picture of kleos is even more limited than the kind of immortality through fame that Gilgamesh seems to arrive at the end of his epic when he looks upon the walls of the city he's built. Unlike Gilgamesh, who can look at the walls of his city Uruk and apparently find some sort of recompense for death in that, for the heroes of the Iliad, kleos can only be gained on the battlefield. And if you think about what that means, it means that the one way of gaining kleos, your one real avenue to immortality, is either through killing others or through dying yourself, or most likely through both. And that's why I call kleos in the Iliad paradoxical. The only form of meaningful immortality available to these warriors is inextricably linked not to any lasting human achievement, but specifically to death and killing. And of course, facing one's own death is only half of the problem of the human condition. That's what Gilgamesh focuses on. He grieves for Enkidu, and then he says, I'm going to die too, and goes off looking for immortality. In the Iliad, the stress is more on the acceptance of the death of those dear to us. Achilles has to come to terms with the fact that Patroclus has died. Achilles has to accept the death of his dearest friend. And the latter part of the Iliad addresses Achilles' difficulty in accepting the human condition, accepting what it means to be human when it applies specifically to Patroclus, to his beloved friend. In books 18 through 23, when Achilles is consumed with a desire for vengeance, he also refuses to accept the reality of Patroclus' death to such an extent that Achilles himself is almost depicted as inhuman in these books. He puts his own life on hold. He will not eat, he won't sleep, he won't bathe, he won't engage in sexual relations. In other words, he will not act like a living adult male human being. It's as though with Patroclus' death, Achilles' own life has gone into abeyance. Fascinatingly, he's described in this section of the Iliad in terms that are normally applied to dead warriors. He lies in the dust grieving for Patroclus, and the verb that's used is a verb that's normally applied to a dead warrior lying in the dust. He utterly rejects Hector's suggestion that whichever one of them kills the other should treat the dead body with respect. Hector, when he's dying, says to Achilles, "Please send my body back to my parents." And Achilles rejects this. He says that there is no one who can hold the dogs off from your head, not if they bring here and set before me 10 times and 20 times the ransom. So he refuses to act appropriately towards the dead, and he refuses to act appropriately in his own life. And even after he has killed Hector and has dishonored Hector's dead body, Achilles still cannot reconcile himself to Patroclus' death. He is acting inappropriately not only towards the dead Hector, but also, interestingly enough, towards the dead Patroclus, because Achilles will not give Patroclus a funeral. Again, he cannot accept the reality that all of us have to accept, that even those we love most dearly do and will and must die. Achilles says, "No, I don't accept that," and yet, of course, he must accept it. He refuses to give Patroclus a funeral until Patroclus' ghost appears and asks for a funeral. Patroclus says, "I'm unburied, my ghost is wandering, I can't get into the underworld with the other dead souls." Now, as I just said, the underworld is not a very pleasant place, but apparently it's even worse to be trapped in between life and death, to be a wandering soul who cannot even get into the underworld. Patroclus' ghost says to Achilles, "Until you bury me, I cannot go into Hades, I cannot go into the underworld. Please give me my funeral." Achilles does. When Patroclus himself asks for it, Achilles gives his friend the appropriate funeral. But even that, a funeral is supposed to provide some sort of acceptance for those who are left living. Even after Patroclus' funeral, Achilles continues to fast, continues not to bathe, and continues to drag Hector's dead corpse behind his chariot wheels. Now he drags it around the tomb of Patroclus rather than around the walls of Troy. But clearly, Achilles is not moving towards any kind of acceptance at all. And finally, the gods themselves decide to intervene. Zeus sends Thetis, Achilles' mother, to speak to him and tell him he has to give Hector's body back to Priam. And Zeus sends Iris, the messenger goddess, to tell Priam, "Go to the camp of the Greeks, visit Achilles' tent, and ransom your son's body." Priam does this. He goes and visits Achilles, and somehow this visit from his enemy allows Achilles to accept the reality of death and loss as nothing else has, as words from his mother, words from his friends, nothing else has gotten through to him. Priam's words do. Priam enters Achilles' tent, kneels before Achilles, kisses his hands, and beseeches him in his father Peleus' name, in Achilles' father's name, to pity Priam and return Hector's body. He says in one of the most beautiful scenes in all of the Iliad, which means in all of Greek literature, Priam speaks to the man who has killed his son. He says, "Achilles, like the gods, remember your father, one who is of years like mine and on the doorsill of sorrowful old age. Surely he, when he hears of you and that you are still living, is gladdened within his heart, and all his days he is hopeful that he will see his beloved son come home from the Troad. But for me, my destiny was evil. I have had the noblest of sons in Troy, but I say not one of them is left to me. 50 were my sons when the sons of the Achaeans came here. 19 were born to me from the womb of a single mother, and of these violent Ares broke the strength in the knees of most of them, but one was left me, who guarded my city and people. That one you killed a few days since, as he fought in defense of his country, Hector, for whose sake I come now." And then he ends up saying, "Honor then the gods, Achilles, and take pity upon me, remembering your father, yet I am still more pitiful. I have gone through what no other mortal on earth has gone through. I put my lips to the hands of the man who has killed my children." And this, somehow, as I say, gets through to Achilles as nothing else has been able to. He reacts with wonder and compassion, agrees to return Hector's body. The two enemies, Priam and Achilles, sit and weep together. The narrator tells us Priam is weeping for Hector, Achilles is weeping for Patroclus, and Achilles comforts Priam by reminding him that all human beings must bear grief, adversity, and pain. Exactly what others have been saying to Achilles, he couldn't hear on his own behalf. He sees this old man kneeling, kissing his hands, and weeping, and then he is able to say, this is what humans must endure. So it's through recognizing the humanity of his enemy that Achilles finally accepts mortality and is thus himself reintegrated into humanity. Now, part of Homer's genius is that he doesn't explain how this happens. He simply shows us that it does. I always feel both extremely presumptuous and extremely inadequate when I try to talk about this scene in the Iliad. It is one of the most powerful scenes anywhere in literature. Homer has the sense not to explain it, but just to present it. I have to try to explain it. I apologize. As this scene moves on, Achilles himself serves a meal to Priam. They eat together. Achilles promises a truce of 11 days so the Trojans can give Hector a proper funeral. Achilles has a bed prepared for Priam, and he himself goes to bed and sleeps beside Briseis. That's the last time we see Achilles in the Iliad. He's fully reintegrated into humanity. The final paradox, of course, is that we, the audience, know, because we know the story, that Achilles himself will now die. He will return to battle and he will himself be killed. So the paradox of Kleos returns. Achilles' reintegration into humanity means reintegration into mortality. He will himself be killed. So in this lecture, we've looked at the Iliad all too briefly. In the next lecture, we will turn to and give an equally brief discussion of the other Homeric epic, the Odyssey.